Chapter 1, The Echo of Rejection. The scent of pine and damp earth usually brought Selene peace, a deep, comforting inhale of her mountainous home. But today, it was choked with the metallic tang of unearned pity. Selene meticulously wiped down the long, scarred wooden tables in the great hall, her movements efficient because she needed the task, the simple, repetitive labor, to anchor herself. She was the ghost of the Crescent Moon Pack, visible only when chores needed finishing or when the Alpha, her estranged father, needed a muted messenger. She felt less like a wolf and more like a necessary shadow. Whispers, sharp as glass shards, snagged the air around her. Still cleaning up after everyone, a low voice sneered, the owner's identity irrelevant, because the sentiment was universal. Selene didn't flinch. She had perfected the art of absorbing the humiliation, tucking it into a cold, hard pocket of her soul. This ingrained isolation, this mistrust of warmth, was her shield. It was her fundamental flaw, the knot she couldn't untangle. If they can't hurt you, they can't reject you again. That's the mantra that had carved deep lines into her heart because the first rejection had nearly splintered her completely. Her eyes, usually downcast, briefly lifted to the tapestry depicting the pack's brutal, triumphant past, a blur of silver wolves and spilled blood. She longed for a fraction of that respect, that hard-won recognition. She wanted to be seen for the courage she possessed, not the common face she wore, yet seeking validation felt like begging for another wound. Suddenly, a sickening noise, a high-pitched yelp from the training field, snapped her attention outward. Selene didn't hesitate. She dropped the cloth, the sudden silence it created louder than any shout, and sprinted toward the sound. Her heart hammered a fierce rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of sudden, pure concern. She found Liam, a young pup barely 2 years old, trapped beneath a stack of displaced logs, his tiny chest heaving with silent sobs. The adults nearby had frozen, paralyzed by the sheer size of the timber and the possibility of shifting too close. They were trained to follow rules, not save a child. Selene saw the situation clearly, assessing the unstable center log, calculating the precise angle. She didn't have the brute strength of a trained male warrior, but she had sharp wits and a startling, hidden intelligence. Like a river carving a canyon, she saw the path of least resistance. With a grunt, she shoved a thin, forgotten wedge of wood beneath the fulcrum, buying herself a single, critical second. Then, with a fierce, almost desperate surge of adrenaline, she shifted the top, lighter log just enough to free the whimpering child. No one cheered. No one rushed to praise her. They simply took Liam, murmuring about how close a call it had been. Selene backed away, her hands shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had sought to prove herself, yet the reward was merely the absence of a disaster, unnoticed. The pack's inability to see her strength was an obstacle she faced daily, a slow, grinding battle that left her perpetually yearning for acknowledgement while simultaneously guarding herself against it. What would it take, she wondered, for them to truly look? Before the profound ache of being overlooked could settle fully, a sound arrived from the dense forest line, the low, resonant hum of approaching vehicles, expensive and heavy. The air itself seemed to crackle and bow down. Whispers immediately replaced the silence, but these were tinged with a delicious, electric fear. Kael, the formidable alpha of the Northern Peak Pack, was arriving. The tension, thick and sweet like sap, prepared to coat them all. Chapter 2, The Cold Alpha's Arrival. Transitioning from the quiet tension of her unnoticed heroism, a hall quickly filled with a nervous energy that vibrated in the floorboards. The Pack Council, sleek and overdressed, fussed with the seating arrangement for the incoming summit. Selene finished setting out the heavy earthenware water pitchers, observing the frantic preening around her. She noted the way the older, more cynical pack members were preparing their most subservient smiles, while the younger wolves were simply awash in curiosity mixed with profound apprehension. Kael was notorious. They called him the Alpha of the Frozen Heart, a ruler whose decisions were as swift and brutal as an Arctic wind. It was a name that carried consequence because his power was absolute and his reputation terrifying. She caught a glimpse of her own reflection in a polished silver tray, unremarkable, slightly too plain, always practical, the antithesis of a potential Luna. Too ugly to be a Luna, the echo of a pack elder's careless remark resurfaced, a nasty little barb she had been carrying since adolescence. That phrase wasn't just about appearance, it was the entire dismissal of her worth, a psychological wound that always prepared her for survival. Selene straightened her spine, a tiny, defiant act visible only to herself. I am here to survive this summit, she resolved. I expect dismissal, and I will meet it with silence. That quiet preparation for dismissal, that certainty of being overlooked, was her armor. In contrast to the rising anxiety of the pack, Selene felt a strange, almost clinical calm. She moved to the edge of the hall, near the massive stone hearth, pretending to inspect the dying embers. She needed distance from the swirling ambition and fear. A knot of young warrior wolves were exchanging nervous jokes, and their leader, Ronan, glanced toward her. Ronan had once been a flicker of hope in her life, a potential friend, until he chose conformity over kindness, ultimately emphasizing that to be overlooked is better than to be actively hated. His eyes swept past her now, registering nothing, just as she predicted. Just as the tension threatened to become unbearable, a sudden silence, deep and absolute, fell over the hall, heavier than a shroud. The outer doors, carved from ancient, dark oak, swung inward on silent hinges. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, a physical sensation that had nothing to do with the weather. Kael entered. He wasn't merely tall, he was an imposing force, broad-shouldered, draped in the dark, heavy pelts of his northern lands. His eyes, the color of cold, chipped slate, scanned the room with merciless scrutiny. He wore his dominance like a second skin. As the imposing figure moved into the light, Selene felt a bizarre, immediate shift in the atmosphere around her. It wasn't merely fear, it was a complex, primal chord of danger and raw, elemental attraction that vibrated deep in her bones. She had never believed in the mythical spark, it was a concept for the beautiful, the chosen. But as his gaze momentarily swept over the back of the hall, a glance so quick it barely registered, she felt a sharp, electrical jolt, like touching a live wire. It was fleeting, unsettling, and utterly confusing. Selene immediately fixed her gaze on the hearth, determined to squash the ridiculous, dangerous feeling before it could breathe. He is a killer, she reminded herself. I am a cleaning staff. That moment of subtle, unwanted ignition, that hint of attraction in the face of profound dread, was the undeniable hook into the coming chaos. Chapter 3: The Accidental Marking. Following the electrifying but momentary tension of Kael's entrance, the formal summit commenced with tedious speeches about regional cooperation and resource allocation. Selene remained on the periphery, her role now that of the silent attendant, refilling water and removing empty platters. The air remained charged, not just with Kael's presence, but with a palpable undercurrent of resentment from several of the neighboring pack leaders. The northern peak pack's reach had become too long, their dominance too absolute, which raised a fundamental question: how long can absolute power exist before it collapses under its own weight? This political subplot, hinting at instability, added a sharp edge to the already tense gathering. She navigated the crowded edges of the room with practiced anonymity. However, fate, driven by a carelessly placed elbow and a shifting floor tile, had other plans. A minor alpha, gesturing wildly to emphasize a point about hunting territory, backed up right into her path. Selene lurched, stumbling forward toward the main table, her center of gravity lost, the heavy, crystal water pitcher slipping from her grasp. She tried desperately to catch it, resulting only in a flailing movement that sent her directly, and catastrophically, into the back of Kael's chair. Despite her immediate, absolute horror, Kael didn't actually fall, but the impact sent a shudder through his rigid posture. The crystal pitcher shattered on the polished floor beside his boot, sending cold water spraying. A collective gasp echoed through the hall, followed instantly by stifled snickers. Selene was a statue of utter mortification. It is worse than I could have imagined, she thought, her cheeks burning so intensely they felt scalded. She knelt instantly, ready to endure the torrent of verbal abuse, preparing for the inevitable public dismissal. This moment of accidental humiliation solidified her fear that she would always be the mistake, the object of mockery. Yet, instead of the crushing disdain she expected, something far stranger occurred. Kael stood slowly, turning to look down at her, not with anger, but with an intense, burning stillness that silenced the remaining titters. His eyes, as fixed on hers, seemed to pierce through the defensive wall she had spent years building. Before either could speak, the true chaos erupted, a sudden, deafening crash from the main entrance, followed by the sickening smell of smoke and unfamiliar, hostile wolf musk. The rival pack, the Timber Fung, had chosen this moment of distraction for their attack, proving that no authority, however cold, is immune to betrayal. In the ensuing, terrifying scramble, Selene didn't think about her personal safety. The ingrained habit of protecting others immediately took over. Kael was momentarily focused on the main threat, issuing commands, his back exposed to a shadowy flank attack from the side. A Timberfong scout, a young wolf with a vicious sneer, broke away from the main skirmish, low and fast, aiming for the Alpha's unprotected spine. Selene reacted purely on instinct, a flash of her inherent courage overriding every fiber of self-preservation. She lunged, throwing herself directly into the path of the scout, knocking the smaller wolf off balance and sending them both sprawling. The scout recovered instantly, snarling and slashing wildly. Selene felt a sharp, searing tear in her shoulder. But before the scout could land a second, fatal blow, Kael moved. He was a terrifying blur of lethal speed. He didn't spare a glance for the scout he neutralized. His immediate focus was entirely on Selene, who was now pinned and bleeding slightly. His eyes were no longer cold slate, they were molten, primal gold. A deep, guttural sound, not human, not quite wolf, ripped from his throat, a sound of pure, overwhelming possession. He lowered his head and clamped his jaw, not on her throat, but on the bleeding wound she had taken for him, asserting dominance and protection in the most fundamental way. It was a primal, public, and shocking act. The entire hall froze. He wasn't just claiming her as protected, the raw, intense heat of his bite, the sudden, fierce jolt of energy that coursed through her veins, was the undeniable, earth-shattering sign. Kael had marked her as his mate. The rejection she had feared all her life was suddenly, violently, replaced by the most terrifying and undeniable claim, irrevocably locking her into conflict with the very man who should have been her destroyer. The scent of pine and damp earth usually brought Selene peace, a deep, comforting inhale of her mountainous home. But today, it was choked with the metallic tang of unearned pity. Selene meticulously wiped down the long, scarred wooden tables in the great hall, her movements efficient because she needed the task, the simple, repetitive labor, to anchor herself. She was the ghost of the Crescent Moon Pack, visible only when chores needed finishing or when the Alpha, her estranged father, needed a muted messenger. She felt less like a wolf and more like a necessary shadow. Whispers, sharp as glass shards, snagged the air around her. Still cleaning up after everyone, a low voice sneered, the owner's identity irrelevant, because the sentiment was universal. Selene didn't flinch. She had perfected the art of absorbing the humiliation, tucking it into a cold, hard pocket of her soul. This ingrained isolation, this mistrust of warmth, was her shield. It was her fundamental flaw, the knot she couldn't untangle. If they can't hurt you, they can't reject you again. That's the mantra that had carved deep lines into her heart because the first rejection had nearly splintered her completely. Her eyes, usually downcast, briefly lifted to the tapestry depicting the pack's brutal, triumphant past, a blur of silver wolves and spilled blood. She longed for a fraction of that respect, that hard-won recognition. She wanted to be seen for the courage she possessed, not the common face she wore, yet seeking validation felt like begging for another wound. Suddenly, a sickening noise, a high-pitched yelp from the training field, snapped her attention outward. Selene didn't hesitate. She dropped the cloth, the sudden silence it created louder than any shout, and sprinted toward the sound. Her heart hammered a fierce rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of sudden, pure concern. She found Liam, a young pup barely 2 years old, trapped beneath a stack of displaced logs, his tiny chest heaving with silent sobs. The adults nearby had frozen, paralyzed by the sheer size of the timber and the possibility of shifting too close. They were trained to follow rules, not save a child. Selene saw the situation clearly, assessing the unstable center log, calculating the precise angle. She didn't have the brute strength of a trained male warrior, but she had sharp wits and a startling, hidden intelligence. Like a river carving a canyon, she saw the path of least resistance. With a grunt, she shoved a thin, forgotten wedge of wood beneath the fulcrum, buying herself a single, critical second. Then, with a fierce, almost desperate surge of adrenaline, she shifted the top, lighter log just enough to free the whimpering child. No one cheered. No one rushed to praise her. They simply took Liam, murmuring about how close a call it had been. Selene backed away, her hands shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had sought to prove herself, yet the reward was merely the absence of a disaster, unnoticed. The pack's inability to see her strength was an obstacle she faced daily, a slow, grinding battle that left her perpetually yearning for acknowledgement while simultaneously guarding herself against it. What would it take, she wondered, for them to truly look? Before the profound ache of being overlooked could settle fully, a sound arrived from the dense forest line, the low, resonant hum of approaching vehicles, expensive and heavy. The air itself seemed to crackle and bow down. Whispers immediately replaced the silence, but these were tinged with a delicious, electric fear. Kael, the formidable alpha of the Northern Peak Pack, was arriving. The tension, thick and sweet like sap, prepared to coat them all. Transitioning from the quiet tension of her unnoticed heroism, a hall quickly filled with a nervous energy that vibrated in the floorboards. The Pack Council, sleek and overdressed, fussed with the seating arrangement for the incoming summit. Selene finished setting out the heavy earthenware water pitchers, observing the frantic preening around her. She noted the way the older, more cynical pack members were preparing their most subservient smiles, while the younger wolves were simply awash in curiosity mixed with profound apprehension. Kael was notorious. They called him the Alpha of the Frozen Heart, a ruler whose decisions were as swift and brutal as an Arctic wind. It was a name that carried consequence because his power was absolute and his reputation terrifying. She caught a glimpse of her own reflection in a polished silver tray, unremarkable, slightly too plain, always practical, the antithesis of a potential Luna. Too ugly to be a Luna, the echo of a pack elder's careless remark resurfaced, a nasty little barb she had been carrying since adolescence. That phrase wasn't just about appearance, it was the entire dismissal of her worth, a psychological wound that always prepared her for survival. Selene straightened her spine, a tiny, defiant act visible only to herself. I am here to survive this summit, she resolved. I expect dismissal, and I will meet it with silence. That quiet preparation for dismissal, that certainty of being overlooked, was her armor. In contrast to the rising anxiety of the pack, Selene felt a strange, almost clinical calm. She moved to the edge of the hall, near the massive stone hearth, pretending to inspect the dying embers. She needed distance from the swirling ambition and fear. A knot of young warrior wolves were exchanging nervous jokes, and their leader, Ronan, glanced toward her. Ronan had once been a flicker of hope in her life, a potential friend, until he chose conformity over kindness, ultimately emphasizing that to be overlooked is better than to be actively hated. His eyes swept past her now, registering nothing, just as she predicted. Just as the tension threatened to become unbearable, a sudden silence, deep and absolute, fell over the hall, heavier than a shroud. The outer doors, carved from ancient, dark oak, swung inward on silent hinges. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, a physical sensation that had nothing to do with the weather. Kael entered. He wasn't merely tall, he was an imposing force, broad-shouldered, draped in the dark, heavy pelts of his northern lands. His eyes, the color of cold, chipped slate, scanned the room with merciless scrutiny. He wore his dominance like a second skin. As the imposing figure moved into the light, Selene felt a bizarre, immediate shift in the atmosphere around her. It wasn't merely fear, it was a complex, primal chord of danger and raw, elemental attraction that vibrated deep in her bones. She had never believed in the mythical spark, it was a concept for the beautiful, the chosen. But as his gaze momentarily swept over the back of the hall, a glance so quick it barely registered, she felt a sharp, electrical jolt, like touching a live wire. It was fleeting, unsettling, and utterly confusing. Selene immediately fixed her gaze on the hearth, determined to squash the ridiculous, dangerous feeling before it could breathe. He is a killer, she reminded herself. I am a cleaning staff. That moment of subtle, unwanted ignition, that hint of attraction in the face of profound dread, was the undeniable hook into the coming chaos. Following the electrifying but momentary tension of Kael's entrance, the formal summit commenced with tedious speeches about regional cooperation and resource allocation. Selene remained on the periphery, her role now that of the silent attendant, refilling water and removing empty platters. The air remained charged, not just with Kael's presence, but with a palpable undercurrent of resentment from several of the neighboring pack leaders. The Northern Peak Pack's reach had become too long, their dominance too absolute, which raised a fundamental question: how long can absolute power exist before it collapses under its own weight? This political subplot, hinting at instability, added a sharp edge to the already tense gathering. She navigated the crowded edges of the room with practiced anonymity. However, fate, driven by a carelessly placed elbow and a shifting floor tile, had other plans. A minor alpha, gesturing wildly to emphasize a point about hunting territory, backed up right into her path. Selene lurched, stumbling forward toward the main table, her center of gravity lost, the heavy, crystal water pitcher slipping from her grasp. She tried desperately to catch it, resulting only in a flailing movement that sent her directly, and catastrophically, into the back of Kael's chair. Despite her immediate, absolute horror, Kael didn't actually fall, but the impact sent a shudder through his rigid posture. The crystal pitcher shattered on the polished floor beside his boot, sending cold water spraying. A collective gasp echoed through the hall, followed instantly by stifled snickers. Selene was a statue of utter mortification. It is worse than I could have imagined, she thought, her cheeks burning so intensely they felt scalded. She knelt instantly, ready to endure the torrent of verbal abuse, preparing for the inevitable public dismissal. This moment of accidental humiliation solidified her fear that she would always be the mistake, the object of mockery. Yet, instead of the crushing disdain she expected, something far stranger occurred. Kael stood slowly, turning to look down at her, not with anger, but with an intense, burning stillness that silenced the remaining titters. His eyes, as fixed on hers, seemed to pierce through the defensive wall she had spent years building. Before either could speak, the true chaos erupted, a sudden, deafening crash from the main entrance, followed by the sickening smell of smoke and unfamiliar, hostile wolf musk. The rival pack, the Timber Fung, had chosen this moment of distraction for their attack, proving that no authority, however cold, is immune to betrayal. In the ensuing, terrifying scramble, Selene didn't think about her personal safety, the ingrained habit of protecting others immediately took over. Kael was momentarily focused on the main threat, issuing commands, his back exposed to a shadowy flank attack from the side. A Timberfong scout, a young wolf with a vicious sneer, broke away from the main skirmish, low and fast, aiming for the alpha's unprotected spine. Selene reacted purely on instinct, a flash of her inherent courage overriding every fiber of self-preservation. She lunged, throwing herself directly into the path of the scout, knocking the smaller wolf off balance and sending them both sprawling. The scout recovered instantly, snarling and slashing wildly. Selene felt a sharp, searing tear in her shoulder. But before the scout could land a second, fatal blow, Kael moved. He was a terrifying blur of lethal speed. He didn't spare a glance for the scout he neutralized, his immediate focus was entirely on Selene, who was now pinned and bleeding slightly. His eyes were no longer cold slate, they were molten, primal gold. A deep, guttural sound, not human, not quite wolf, ripped from his throat, a sound of pure, overwhelming possession. He lowered his head and clamped his jaw, not on her throat, but on the bleeding wound she had taken for him, asserting dominance and protection in the most fundamental way. It was a primal, public, and shocking act. The entire hall froze. He wasn't just claiming her as protected, the raw, intense heat of his bite, the sudden, fierce jolt of energy that coursed through her veins, was the undeniable, earth-shattering sign. Kael had marked her as his mate. The rejection she had feared all her life was suddenly, violently, replaced by the most terrifying and undeniable claim, irrevocably locking her into conflict with the very man who should have been her destroyer. Chapter 4: The Primal Claim. The intense heat of Kael's jaw on her shoulder felt less like a wound and more like an electric brand. The pain of the Timberfang scout's claws vanished, replaced by a blinding, staggering surge of belonging that was both horrifying and intoxicating. Selene's vision swam, not from blood loss, but from the sheer, raw power of the connection snapping into place, a chain forged in fire and absolute necessity. The air, which moments ago had smelled of smoke and fear, now reeked purely of Kael, pine, frost, and untamed dominance. His guttural sound of possession, that powerful, non-human growl, echoed in the shocked silence of the great hall. Everyone watched, paralyzed by the sight of the ruthless Alpha, the Alpha of the frozen heart, publicly claiming the pack's ghost. He released her, but the connection remained, a vibrant, humming wire stretching between their cores. His slate-colored eyes, still alight with that unnatural golden intensity, held hers captive. They were intense, demanding, and utterly foreign to the cold detachment she had witnessed moments prior. "Mine," he declared, his voice rough, thick with the sound of gravel and absolute command. The word was a sentence, a decree, and a crushing revelation all at once. Selene scrambled back slightly, the lingering heat on her shoulder a terrifying anchor. Her internal state was a tempest, shock battled with a rising, traitorous spike of desire, and beneath it all, the familiar, crippling fear of rejection wrestled with the terrifying novelty of being chosen. She wanted to flee, but her feet were rooted, held fast by the invisible, tightening leash of the mate bond. As the adrenaline began to recede from the fight, the consequences of his action became chillingly clear. Her pack, the Crescent Moon, gasped, their eyes wide with jealousy, confusion, and a sudden, unwelcome respect for the girl they had spent years ignoring. Ronan, the warrior who had dismissed her, looked sickened, his face a mask of disbelief because this shocking turn of events defied every social law they knew. This forced proximity, this immediate, public commitment, was a nightmare for Selene's carefully constructed emotional defenses. She had built a fortress of isolation, and Kael had just blown the gate off its hinges. "This cannot be real," her mind screamed. "I am Selene, the overlooked." Not his. However, the reality of the situation demanded immediate attention. The Timberfang scout, whom Kael had dispatched with terrifying efficiency, was gone, pulled back by their retreating war party. The threat had subsided, but the political mess was just beginning. Kael bent low, his shadow engulfing her, his scent overpowering, an invasive perfume of dominance. "Stand," he commanded, the single word cutting through the confusion of the hall. She obeyed instantly, the inherent submission to an alpha, especially a mate alpha, overwhelming her will. This was the true conflict, navigating this unwanted, forced bond while desperately protecting the fragile self she had barely kept intact. In the sudden, strange vacuum of the aftermath, Kael addressed her pack leaders with brutal simplicity. "She is marked," he stated, his voice now regaining its customary cold edge, though a metallic rasp still lingered. "She returns with me to Northern Peak. Today." His declaration was met with a chorus of anxious murmurs. Selene felt a sickening drop in her stomach. Her immediate goal shifted, she needed information, she needed to understand the mechanics of this involuntary union. She looked up at him, gathering every scrap of courage. "You cannot simply take me," she whispered, her voice shaking but firm. "I am not a possession, I am a wolf of this pack." Her statement was a deliberate challenge to his authority, a necessity because she refused to become simply a prize. Kael's lip twitched, a minuscule expression that spoke volumes of surprise and dark amusement. "You intervened for me," he countered, his gaze burning, "and now the world knows. You are marked, and my world is dangerous. You navigate this forced proximity with me, or you face the consequences of both packs believing you betrayed the Northern Peak. Protection is not optional." This confirmed her fate, raising the external and internal stakes exponentially, locking her into the inescapable orbit of the cold Alpha. Chapter 5, Whispers and Wariness. Following Kael's chilling decree and her own ill-fated defiance, Selene found herself confined to a small, secure guest room awaiting their imminent departure. The shock of the marking hadn't worn off, it felt like a heavy cloak draped over her senses, muffling reality. Every beat of her heart now carried an unwelcome rhythmic pull, a faint tug toward the powerful presence of Kael, somewhere down the hall. This sudden, agonizing intimacy with a man feared throughout the continent was the most profound violation of her isolated existence. "I am a wolf who prefers silence," she lamented internally. "Now I am bound to a storm." The uncertainty of her future was a sharp spike of fear, intensified because she knew nothing of his pack's dynamics, only rumors of their cold brutality. A soft knock interrupted her frantic internal spiral. Kael entered, dispensing with the ceremony. The silence he brought was not restful, it was heavy, pregnant with unsaid things and simmering power. He was wearing different clothes now, black leather and thick wool, smelling intensely of pine and something subtly metallic. Selene crossed her arms, a small, involuntary movement of self-protection. "Why?" she asked, cutting straight to the core of her confusion. "You didn't need a mate. You could have saved me without the public claim." Her voice was low, edged with both fear and fierce curiosity. Unlike the brief, sharp exchanges in the main hall, Kael seemed to consider her question. He leaned against the doorframe, a sculpture of controlled power, his features unreadable. "The Timberfang attack was a demonstration," he explained, his voice a low vibration that stroked the air. "A challenge to my lineage. To accept protection from a lesser pack, without asserting a permanent, binding claim, shows weakness. It suggests I was desperate, or worse, that I relied on an outsider. I claimed you instantly, aggressively, because that is the language of survival among high alphas. It establishes dominance over the situation, not just over you." His cold logic was horrifyingly sound. This early emotional connection was purely pragmatic on his side, yet it was the start of something, the first subtle spark of shared understanding, even if that understanding was terrifying. As the conversation progressed, Selene learned the bare minimum of her new life. Northern Peak was harsher, colder, ruled by stringent, ancient laws. Her role was not yet Luna, she was simply the claimed, a position of intense scrutiny and immense danger. "My expectations are simple," Kael continued, his eyes scanning her face, looking for weakness. "You will be silent, observant, and you will not embarrass the Northern Peak. Show strength, not that pathetic humility your father's pack instilled." He was challenging her ability to adapt, to survive the inevitable pack scrutiny that awaited her, pushing the exact buttons that triggered her deep-seated fear of failure. Yet, beneath his authoritarian tone, Selene perceived a flicker of something she couldn't name. She pressed him, determined to gain a sliver of ground. "And what are your weaknesses, Alpha Kael?" she dared to ask. "What must I observe to protect you?" This unexpected question, a direct demand for shared vulnerability, stopped him. A shadow crossed his face, fleeting and deep, a momentary glimpse into a carefully guarded pain, a hint of the hidden vulnerability she was destined to discover later. He merely straightened, pushing off the frame. "You focus on keeping yourself alive," claimed Selene, he retorted, his voice regaining its icy shield. "That is your current, singular goal." The scene ended with Kael asserting his protective instincts flaring, a possessive, territorial look that was far more than political. The threat of the Timberfang pack and the unspoken threat of Kael's own secrets, bound them together, escalating the physical tension between the two, a dangerous, magnetic pull. Chapter 6, First Test of Fire. Following the intense, confined conversation with Kael, the journey to Northern Peak was a blur of high-speed travel through cold, densely forested lands. Selene had little time to process the magnitude of her predicament. She sat beside Kael in a heavily armored vehicle, the silence between them a living thing, thick with unaddressed tension. She realized the mark on her shoulder pulsed gently, a slow, deep thrumming that was inextricably linked to Kael's steady, immense heartbeat. She was physically adapting, her body recognizing its master, because the mate bond bypassed intellectual reasoning. She tried to focus instead on the dynamics she had just learned. Kael was respected, but his rule was not universally loved, creating an open loop of political opposition within his own domain. The moment they arrived at the Northern Peak compound, the air turned instantly hostile. It wasn't the smell of an enemy, it was the sharp, challenging scent of entrenched wolves assessing an intruder. The architecture was imposing, all dark stone and iron, a fortress built for war and cold isolation. As Kael led her across the enormous courtyard, the faces of the Northern Peak wolves were openly critical. Their eyes moved from Kael's formidable presence to her, the small, plain outsider, with obvious disdain. In the midst of this overwhelming scrutiny, a figure stepped directly into their path, a statuesque, silver-furred beta named Anya. Anya was stunning, radiating power and resentment. She had been Kael's most loyal second-in-command for years, and her expression was lethal. Alpha, Anya acknowledged Kael with a stiff nod, but her entire posture, her coiled readiness, the sharp, proprietary scent she released, was directed at Selene. Anya represented the immediate, internal threat to Selene's survival within the pack hierarchy. This, claimed, needs proper introduction to our ranks. She will not embarrass us, Anya stated, the word claimed dripping with sarcasm, a clear provocation designed to force Selene into submission. Rather than intervening to protect her, Kael merely gave a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head. Show her, he replied, his gaze still fixed forward, letting the challenge stand. This was her first true test, a political and social baptism by fire. Selene knew instinctively that to shrink back, to show the humility she had perfected in her old pack, would be fatal here. Anya was a rival pack member, but more importantly, a powerful alpha figure within Kael's own court, and her provocation was a critical test of her worth. Drawing upon the quiet courage she had shown saving the pup Liam, Selene met Anya's intense, challenging stare. She didn't raise her voice, but she allowed a thread of hard defiance to enter her tone. I will not embarrass the Northern Peak, Selene stated calmly, looking Anya directly in the eye. I know my place. I also know I am claimed by your alpha, an action that carries consequences you must accept. Her response was not an emotional outburst, it was an assertion of political fact, leveraging Kael's power without relying on his protection. The impact was instant, Anya's eyes widened fractionally. It was a small victory, a subtle shift in the dynamics that surprised the onlookers because they expected tears or submission. Yet, the challenge was far from over. Anya retaliated with a final, cutting remark designed to wound. The alpha will soon tire of a trinket, especially one so fragile. But Selene was already moving past, ignoring the jab. She walked swiftly to catch up to Kael, matching his pace. As they moved into the shadowed fortress corridor, Kael finally glanced down at her, a strange, calculating flicker in his slate eyes. You do not break easily, he murmured, a statement that was undeniably the highest form of praise he could offer. Just as the tension settled into a dangerous equilibrium, their bodies brushed in the narrow hallway. The physical/sexual tension between them, fueled by the bond and the shared danger, escalated intensely, a sharp, sudden heat that left Selene breathless and ready for the next, inevitable conflict. Chapter 7, The Prisoner and the Ghost. The deeper Selene went into the Northern Peak fortress, the colder the air became, the stone walls seemingly absorbing all warmth and light. The pervasive scent of pine and frost that defined Kael was everywhere, overwhelming her senses, a constant, physical reminder of her new captivity. Following the sharp, challenging exchange with Anya, Selene found herself alone in a vast, opulent suite, a gilded cage that felt profoundly unsettling. The tension of the mate bond throbbed steadily in her shoulder, an insistent, rhythmic pull that demanded her attention, demanding her submission. She hated the feeling, yet the intense, electric current it created was strangely addictive, a chemical reaction overriding her carefully cultivated wariness. Kael arrived later, the sound of his footsteps on the polished stone floor a heavy, measured beat. He carried himself with the silence of a predator, his presence immediately filling the expansive room. This was their first true private meeting since the marking, a moment where the political facade was stripped away, leaving only the complex, terrifying reality of their forced union. Selene refused to look away, meeting his gaze with the same stubborn defiance she had displayed to Anya. She knew that showing weakness would invite domination, a fate she was determined to avoid, even if her body ached with the desire to simply yield to his immense power. Instead of delivering further commands, Kael observed her, his eyes, the color of storm clouds, charting the landscape of her fear and resilience. "You survived Anya's challenge," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "That is acceptable. But the game here is not humility, it is trust, and you carry a wolf's mistrust in your very scent." Selene flinched internally. Her flaw, the deep-seated inability to trust anyone because of her past rejections, was starkly visible to him. She yearned to understand him, the ice-cold alpha whose actions were governed by brutal pragmatism rather than emotion. "You claimed me for politics," she countered, pushing the boundary. "What do you want, truly, from this forced bond?" He approached her slowly, a deliberate invasion of her space, the scent of him intensifying to a near-physical pressure. "I want peace in my territory," he murmured, his breath warm against the cold air, contrasting sharply with his reputation. "And you are the chaos that threatens to end it." He stopped inches away, close enough for her to feel the immense, suppressed heat radiating off his body, yet he made no move to touch her. This early emotional connection was fragile, built on fear and curiosity. Selene could see the battle lines drawn in his face, the alpha's ruthless discipline fighting against the primal, undeniable call of the mate bond. Just as the tension reached a nearly unbearable peak, Kael shifted the subject with brutal efficiency, testing her knowledge. "The Timberfang attack was clumsy, orchestrated," he stated, his tone shifting to business. "It was designed to expose a weakness in my security." "What weakness do you see?" He was challenging her, not merely as a mate, but as a mind. Selene, guarded yet intrigued, immediately recalled the scene in the hall, the minor alpha who had nearly knocked her over, whose gestures had been too flamboyant. "The attack required a distraction," she said, choosing her words carefully. "The alpha who caused the commotion, he was too loud, too careless. He created the chaos that allowed the scout to flank you. He is the distraction, perhaps the weak link." Her sudden insight, her ability to analyze the event with cold precision, seemed to momentarily surprise Kael, the subtle spark of attraction between them growing into something more compelling than just desire. This small victory gave her courage because she realized that her intelligence, not her physical strength, was the only true weapon she possessed against his dominance. Their shared moment of strategic assessment tightened the unspoken bond between them, but the mystery of Kael's true motives, why he let Anya challenge her, why he suddenly sought her counsel, remained the central, tantalizing hook. Chapter 8: The Weight of Expectations. Following the unexpected, strategy-focused interlude with Kael, Selene was granted a harsh, accelerated education in the dynamics of the Northern Peak Pack. The wolves here lived by a code of ruthless efficiency. There were no soft places, no quiet corners for the weak. Selene spent her days adapting, observing the complex network of rivalries and alliances that held Kael's territory together. She realized that Kael's expectations were brutally simple: perform or perish. It was a culture shock that forced her to shed the passive, self-deprecating skin she had worn for years. She had to be a mirror of their harsh environment. One morning, while navigating the lower barracks, she overheard a whispered argument between two senior warriors concerning a border dispute. One was advocating for a violent strike, the other for careful negotiation. Selene, unseen in the shadows, recognized the tactical flaw in the aggressive approach. It left their southern flank dangerously exposed, a geographical detail Kael's council had overlooked. Like a hunter assessing tracks in fresh snow, she pieced together the vulnerability instantly. She realized that to keep her claimed status, she needed to offer value, and intelligence was her only currency. Contrasting the quiet intensity of her observations, her nights were plagued by a rising, uncontrollable tide of desire, fueled by the mate bond. Kael maintained a physical distance, but the connection was a constant, shimmering wire. One evening, during a pack dinner held in the cavernous hall, a rival pack member, the Alpha of the Ironwood territory, made a subtle, public mockery of Selene's lack of pedigree. The Northern Peak Alpha is known for his strength, the Ironwood Alpha sneered, his voice loud enough for all to hear. I see his new acquisition requires protection just to hold her cup. Instead of crumbling under the pressure, Selene reacted with sharp, calculated composure. She didn't lash out. She chose a small, but vital victory. Looking directly at the Alpha, she spoke in a calm, clear voice that carried surprising authority. My strength lies in seeing the threat you present, she stated firmly. It is not the cup I hold that worries you, but the territory I now stand upon. The only thing fragile here is the truce you came to negotiate. The impact was palpable. The Ironwood Alpha spluttered, caught off guard because he expected tears, not defiance. He hadn't just been rebuffed, he had been politically neutralized, with the subtle implication that her eyes, and by extension, Kael's, were watching his movements. The unexpected confrontation was the midpoint shift of this act. Later that night, Kael sought her out in the fortress library, its high shelves holding centuries of wolf lore. The tension between them was thick, electric, a storm-gathering force. He cornered her subtly between two stacks of ancient leather-bound scrolls. His eyes, usually granite, were softened by a strange, unsettling vulnerability. You challenged him, Kael whispered, his voice dangerously low. You showed him teeth. Selene felt herself trembling, not purely from fear, but from the intoxicating proximity. I adapted, she retorted breathily. You demanded I survive, and I seek to prove myself. The weight of the silent, unspoken emotion in the room became unbearable. Suddenly, Kael reached out, not to dominate, but to brush a lock of hair from her cheek, a gesture of unexpected, devastating tenderness. Survival here requires trust, he murmured, his gaze locked with hers. Selene saw it then, a brief, heartbreaking flash of the hidden vulnerability she was destined to discover, a flicker of childhood betrayal, a deep, ancient fear of being hurt that mirrored her own. The game changed instantly, the emotional stakes spiked. The mate bond grew uncontrollable, a fierce, undeniable recognition that locked them together not just physically, but psychically. This forbidden intimacy, this glimpse into the cold Alpha's secret weakness, was the irreversible turning point, setting the stage for the dramatic, approaching crisis. Chapter 9, The Gathering Storm. Building on the unexpected, fragile intimacy revealed in the library, Selene realized that her emotional war with Kael had shifted from resistance to a dangerous, reluctant engagement. She was committed now, not just to surviving the Northern Peak, but to understanding the cold, damaged man who claimed her. However, the external threats were rapidly intensifying, the atmosphere outside the fortress growing heavy and dark. The Ironwood Alpha, humiliated by her clever deflection, had not retreated. Instead, he had escalated his presence, moving his perimeter scouts closer to Kael's boundaries. A crisis was clearly approaching, forcing Selene to make herself invaluable quickly. She actively began to fight the pack prejudice, particularly the relentless, chilly scrutiny of Anya, by consistently proving her worth in strategy meetings. She wasn't aggressive, she was simply right, pointing out blind spots in the border patrols with cool, factual logic. Her goal was no longer to assert power, it was to protect the bond and the territory, a new, fierce determination taking root because she realized Kael's safety was now her own. The rising danger created a necessity that drew Selene and Kael physically closer. Their planning sessions became intense, late-night affairs held in the war room, fueled by steaming black coffee and the constant, thrumming awareness of their bond. During one session, as Kael was tracing a critical defense line on a large map, their hands brushed. It was a fleeting contact, but the resulting jolt was fierce, sending a wave of electric sensation through Selene's entire body. Kael froze, his immense body rigid, his breathing suddenly shallow. He turned to her, his slate eyes clouded with a dark, desperate need that mirrored her own rising desire. The sexual tension was explosive, a silent language they were both struggling and failing to ignore. The inevitability of the crisis forced Selene to confront a life-altering choice. The Ironwood Alpha, realizing he could not defeat Kael politically, shifted his focus to Selene, the clear weak point in the Alpha's armor. A messenger arrived late one night, a single, black feather, a recognized symbol of a pending attack targeting the weakest link. Selene understood instantly. She was the target for kidnapping, a political maneuver that would force Kael to surrender his influence. She had a choice, to flee, to save herself and spare Kael the political embarrassment, or to stand and fight, accepting the danger and submitting fully to Kael's claim, becoming the Luna he needed. She stood resolute, her internal conflict resolving into courage. When Kael found her an hour later, she wasn't hiding. She was sharpening a forgotten silver blade she had found in her room, a quiet, focused determination radiating from her. "I know the threat," she stated simply, the steel glinting in the low light. "I won't run." Her fear of rejection and inadequacy was still present, a tight knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, undeniable longing to stand beside him, an equal in the coming battle. She had to resolve the final conflict. She had to either submit to his claim fully, transforming from the claimed to the undeniable mate, or resist. Her choice locked them both into the final, harrowing confrontation. The physical and emotional stakes were now at their maximum, the final, undeniable pull toward the climax. Chapter 10, The Serpent's Coil. The scent of danger now hung thick in the air of Northern Peak, a sharp, metallic odor that made every wolf restless. Following her determined declaration to stay and fight, Selene felt a profound shift in her dynamic with Kael. The lingering wariness between them began to erode, replaced by a desperate, shared focus. However, the external enemy, the Ironwood Alpha, was proving to be a master manipulator. He didn't launch a direct assault, instead, he targeted Selene's position subtly, exploiting the deep-seated prejudice of the Northern Peak elders. Selene attempted to assert her growing tactical understanding during a High Council meeting, proposing a counter-strategy against Ironwood's flank movements. Her logic was sound, born from her keen observation of the terrain. But the elder wolves, figures whose loyalty was ancient and rigid, scoffed openly. A scavenger's perspective on wolf warfare, one elder sneered, dismissing her insight with a wave of his hand. They refused to listen, their pride a massive, immovable obstacle. Selene struggled to maintain her dignity, the fear of being marginalized, of proving the elders right, mixed horribly with fierce defiance. This ingrained pack prejudice was a calculated move by Ironwood, designed to pressure Kael by undermining his mate. In the shadow of the elders' dismissal, Kael's patience began to fray, not with Selene, but with the political maneuvering. He didn't defend her publicly, instead, he pulled her aside immediately after the meeting, leading her into his private study. The room was dominated by dark wood and the cold gleam of silver weapons. "They seek to test my judgment through your failure," Kael murmured, his hands gripping the edge of his massive oak desk. His knuckles were white. "They believe a strong alpha must control his mate, not rely on her counsel." The pressure was building, a heavy weight pushing both protagonists toward a breaking point. However, the true danger was not the elders' disapproval. That night, a trusted lieutenant in Kael's ranks, a warrior named Yarrick, whose family had served the Northern Peak for generations, was found injured near the southern border. The official report cited an Ironwood scout attack. But when Selene, utilizing her quiet observation skills, visited the injured wolf, something felt wrong. Jarek's wounds were clean, too precise, and the accompanying scent was subtly wrong, not the raw musk of ironwood, but something closer, something concealed. Like a poison seeping into the wellspring, the idea of internal betrayal began to fester. This hidden possibility of a traitor within Kael's most trusted circle was the midpoint shift, the game changer. Selene realized she couldn't simply fight the enemy outside, she had to look for the serpent coiled inside the fortress. She risked everything, approaching Kael late that evening as he stood on the parapet overlooking the snowy plains, his profile etched against the cold moon. Jarek did not receive those wounds from Ironwood, she stated, without preamble. I believe the enemy is being aided from within. She revealed her quiet observation, the subtle inconsistencies in the official story. Kael turned, his eyes piercing through the darkness, no longer cold, but intensely vulnerable. He didn't refute her, the shadow of past betrayal, the deep secret she had glimpsed earlier, momentarily resurfaced in his gaze. He had been betrayed once as a pup, a wound that had turned him into the Alpha of the frozen heart. Now, her revelation threatened to rip that old wound open. The shift was immediate and profound. Kael realized that his rigid control was useless against a hidden enemy, and he couldn't control his surging feelings for the mate who saw the truth he desperately wanted to ignore. The bond between them grew uncontrollable, no longer just a shared pain, but a shared, terrifying secret. The intensity of their connection, fueled by forbidden intimacy and shared peril, surged. The antagonist, Ironwood, continued to escalate his political moves, but the most urgent threat now lay inside the walls. Kael and Selene were drawn closer not by choice, but by the necessity of survival, setting the stage for the dramatic and urgent point of no return. Chapter 11, The Razor's Edge. Following the shattering realization of possible internal betrayal, the pace of life in Northern Peak accelerated into a frantic, nerve-wracking existence. Selene and Kael worked in secret, tracing the subtle, almost invisible leaks in Kael's command structure. Selene actively engaged in the dangerous game, setting small, quiet traps to flush out the traitor. She was no longer the shrinking ghost, she was focused, driven, committing fully to this high-stakes battle for survival, love, and the future of the pack. She knew that to hesitate now would mean not just her death, but Kael's downfall. One morning, she left a carefully planted, false piece of information about Kael's inspection route in a place only a few key, trusted individuals could access. Her action was a direct challenge to the internal conspiracy, a move that forced the hidden enemy to react. That afternoon, the false route she had created was ambushed, not by Ironwood warriors, but by a handful of Northern Peak guards who had defected, proving her theory right. The commitment of her enemies solidified her own resolve. The consequences of her action were severe. The traitor, realizing he was exposed, retaliated instantly by orchestrating a public challenge to Selene's legitimacy. During the evening gathering, the elder who had previously mocked her stood up, demanding a formal, ancient rite of acceptance. The claimed must prove she possesses the purity of spirit and strength of mind to protect the Alpha, the elder announced, his voice booming with calculated malice. The rite required her to fast and meditate for 3 days in the pack's sacred, unheated stone vault, a test designed to break the unprepared. This was an attempt to murder her with ceremony, a political maneuver that Kael could not openly refuse because it was mandated by ancient law. As the terrifying reality of the challenge settled upon her, Kael found her moments later by the cold, bubbling spring in the courtyard. The despair she felt was quickly turning into fierce determination, but Kael's face was etched with raw fury. I will not let them do this, he growled, the Alpha control slipping, revealing the terrified mate beneath. His fear of losing her, his fear of watching the pack laws hurt her, was palpable. This forced him to acknowledge his deepening reliance on her. You have to trust me, she insisted, placing her hand briefly on his arm, a gesture of desperate reassurance. I can survive the stone. We need to know who pushed for this challenge. Her courage was infectious, transforming his fear into a renewed resolve. This escalating danger pushed them past the final emotional barrier. That night, just hours before she was due to enter the vault, Kael came to her room, his expression dark and utterly consumed by need. There was no negotiation, only the raw, urgent reality of their bond. The escalating danger forced Selene to make the final choice, to surrender to Kael's claim or resist. She moved into his embrace, her body answering his demand with an equal, desperate longing. The passion that erupted between them was fierce, a storm of desperate intimacy, not soft love, but a ferocious claim that bound them physically and emotionally, sealing their destiny. Chapter 12, The Black Silence. Following the desperate, intimate claim that sealed their allegiance, Selene entered the stone vault at dawn. The door, heavy oak banded with iron, clanged shut behind her, plunging her into a profound, suffocating darkness and cold. This was the all-is-lost moment of the act, a period of utter isolation designed to test her mettle and break her spirit. The cold was immediate and paralyzing, seeping into her bones. Her isolation was absolute. She focused on the memory of Kael's eyes, the molten gold of his possession, clinging to the fierce, new love they had just forged. On the outside, the situation was descending rapidly into chaos. The traitor, exposed but not yet caught, exploited Selene's absence, feeding Kael's external enemies false information. Kael, distracted and tormented by the fact that he had allowed his mate to face this ritualistic confinement, made a strategic mistake, moving his defenses based on bad intelligence. His emotional distraction led to a major setback. Ironwood, sensing the weakness and internal division, launched a calculated attack on one of Kael's key resource centers, crippling their supply lines and publicly humiliating the Northern Peak Alpha. The news of the setback reached the pack, creating a wave of shock and despair. Kael, betrayed both politically and emotionally, faced an internal collapse. The elders, seizing the moment, challenged his leadership, demanding he renounce the unproven, cursed mate who had brought discord to their doors. Kael stood alone, his authority shaken, his heart isolated and vulnerable. He faced the true depth of his fear, the fear of loss and the fear of his own inability to protect the one person he had finally allowed himself to rely on. Inside the black silence of the stone vault, Selene felt the weight of the external collapse. The physical hunger and cold were secondary to the emotional desolation. She confronted her deepest internal demons, the fear of rejection, the certainty of inadequacy that had been her lifelong shadow. She realized the ritual was designed to force resignation. The final, quiet reflection settled upon her: if she died here, Kael would be crushed, his rule would fail, and her life would have been a final, pointless sacrifice. All hope, all external support, seemed lost. The crucible moment had arrived, forcing her to find strength not in Kael's bond, but within her own broken soul. She needed a new inner power, a desperate internal realization that would set the stage for the final push. Selene had to choose to live. She recognized that her past rejection was not a flaw, but a wellspring of resilience, a profound certainty that she had nothing left to lose. She was the rejected one, the survivor of years of scorn. She was not fragile, she was tempered steel. This quiet, revolutionary internal realization, that she was worthy of the fight and worthy of Kael's love, was the true climax of her despair. The moment of resignation passed, replaced by a fierce, quiet resolve. She would survive this cold tomb, and when she emerged, she would not be the claimed. She would be Luna. The black silence would soon break, setting the stage for the desperate, final push. Chapter 13, The Strength of Steel. The third dawn found Selene standing upright in the sacred stone vault, her body numb from the cold, but her spirit burning with an icy, ferocious clarity. The shattering despair of the all-is-lost moment had crystallized into pure, unyielding resolve. She had faced the deepest shadows of her insecurity and emerged convinced of her own worth. The mate bond, which had felt like a chain, now felt like a core of incredible, shared strength. She realized the Northern Peak Pack needed more than just a fierce alpha, they needed a Luna who had survived isolation and political ruin, a leader who understood the brutal cost of rejection. The heavy iron door groaned open, revealing Kael standing silhouetted against the morning light. He looked ravaged, his face gaunt with stress, his clothes dusted with the dirt of a relentless, unsuccessful search for the internal traitor. His relief at seeing her alive was immediately apparent, a raw, naked emotion that he rarely showed. But the look in his eyes was instantly tempered by the pack elders surrounding him, their faces cold, waiting for her failure. They expected a ghost, they found a warrior. As she stepped out, blinking against the harsh light, the elder who had demanded the ritual spoke, his voice dripping with false concern. She is clearly weakened, Alpha. The spirit failed. This chaos is her fault. Selene did not wait for Kael to defend her. She looked directly at the elder, her voice ringing clear and strong, cutting through the frosty air. I survived your test, she declared, her posture perfectly straight, defying hunger and cold. The chaos is not caused by my spirit, but by the weakness in your security. You demanded this ritual to distract Kael while a known traitor led Ironwood to attack our supply lines. Her revelation hit the elders like a physical blow. She had used the time of isolation to think clearly, piecing together the political and military vulnerabilities. Her sudden, sharp assertion of power shifted the dynamic instantly. Kael, seeing the steel in her eyes, responded with immediate, absolute support. He didn't ask how she knew, he simply absorbed her intelligence. The ritual is complete, Kael announced, his voice regaining the resonant power of a true alpha. The accusations are baseless. Her spirit is pure. But Selene pressed the point, seizing the momentum. She looked around at the faces, Anya, the warriors, the elders, who had scorned her. She made a demand that committed fully to the survival of the pack. The traitor is known to me. We must move now before he exploits our remaining vulnerability. Her determination was a mirror to Kael's own, strengthening the bond between them. The rising need for decisive action led to an urgent, intimate confrontation. Kael pulled her away, rushing her to the war room. The fierce, silent energy between them was overwhelming, a mixture of shared fear and devastating, renewed desire. He gripped her hands, his touch hard, desperate. You risked everything, he muttered, his eyes blazing with a mixture of possessiveness and respect. You were right about Jarek's involvement in the ambush. His tracks were confirmed after the supply raid. You see what I miss. He confessed his failure, his admission of reliance, an act of profound vulnerability. This established the new foundation of their relationship, equals in strategy, bound by shared trust. The shared risk solidified their commitment, locking them into the final, desperate confrontation with the traitor in Ironwood. Chapter 14, The Traitor's Gambit. Building on the raw, shared trust forged after Selene's emergence, she and Kael immediately set about formulating a plan for the final showdown. The traitor, revealed to be Jarek's father, an influential, ambitious elder named Torvin, had already fled the compound, taking critical defense codes with him and heading toward Ironwood territory. This confirmed that the internal and external threats were now one, raising the stakes to a lethal maximum. Selene and Kael gathered their most trusted allies, including a wary but newly respectful Anya, and laid out their strategy in the war room. Kael was focused and driven, his energy a fierce, controlled fire. Selene, standing beside him, was his equal, her insights cutting through the military jargon with ruthless efficiency. She confronted her fears, articulating the one weakness they could not ignore. Torvin will lead Ironwood through the old Silver Pass, an ancient route only the elders know. We must intercept them there, or they will split our forces in two. Her strategic clarity cemented her position as Luna in the minds of the senior warriors. The tactical preparation was intense, forcing unprecedented intimacy. While Kael was examining weapon stores, Selene found him momentarily alone. She approached him, not as a mate, but as a co-commander. We must address the internal unrest, she advised, speaking of the lingering skepticism among the lower ranks. Give them a visible symbol of defiance and hope before the fight. Her suggestion showed not just courage, but an innate understanding of pack psychology. Kael studied her, his fierce gaze softened by a trace of awe. "You are the symbol," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "You survived the cold. You exposed the betrayal. That is enough." However, their strategy was immediately countered. Torvin, the traitor, noticed the increased activity and correctly surmised they were mobilizing. He didn't wait for Ironwood. He initiated a devastating, final attack designed to cripple the Northern Peak leadership. A series of controlled explosions rocked the perimeter walls, timed perfectly to coincide with the deployment of their best warriors. The antagonist had escalated the conflict, demanding immediate, violent action. Kael roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury, and mobilized the remaining forces. The urgency of the moment escalated the personal stakes. Kael gripped Selene's hand, the cold metal of his war gloves contrasting with the intense heat of his skin. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice thick with authority and desperate care. "This is not your fight." Selene shook her head, her gaze locked with his, her determination unwavering. "It is my life, Kael," she stated, using his name deliberately, a fierce assertion of their equal bond. "I am the reason they attack, I will be the reason they fail." Her words were a definitive answer to the escalating danger. Kael realized he could not command her away, he could only command her. He handed her a silver-tipped combat knife, his expression a mixture of acceptance and terrifying resolve. The tension between them was palpable, a desperate recognition that they might not both return. They were locked in a collision course with the final confrontation, their emotional and romantic stakes maximized. Chapter 15, Run for the Pass. With the explosions still echoing through the dark valleys, Selene and Kael raced through the fortified tunnels beneath the compound, leading a small, elite strike team toward the critical Silver Pass. The execution of their plan was underway, but the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and the icy realization that their lives were balanced on a razor's edge. Selene ran beside Kael, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm that somehow matched his steady, powerful strides. She was no longer just running from fear, she was running toward a destiny she had claimed, not been given. Their plan was desperate: intercept Torvin and Ironwood at the narrow, treacherous mouth of the Silver Pass before Ironwood's main force could use it to surround Northern Peak. The path was dark, lit only by the sliver of a waning moon and the anxious flickers of their handheld lights. The intensity of their situation was a physical weight. Kael moved with a terrifying grace, his attention split between leading the defense and the unwavering presence of his mate beside him. He subtly shifted his body to shield her from potential shadows, a protective instinct he could not suppress. The anticipation was excruciating, but necessary for the plan to succeed. As they reached the rough, uneven ground leading to the pass, Kael halted the team, signaling for silence. He turned to Selene, his expression grim. "The risk is highest now," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "If they have scouts in the hills, they will be watching." He confirmed their shared terror, and Selene understood the implicit question, "Are you ready to die here?" Instead of answering the question, she focused on their strategy, pulling him back from the paralyzing fear. "We must separate," she stated quickly, pointing to a barely visible, steep goat track leading up the ridge. "I will take Anya and the scouts up there. The path is dangerous, but we will have the high ground. You take the main force through the pass mouth." We hit them simultaneously. Her insight was tactically brilliant, sacrificing safety for a decisive advantage. Kael hesitated, the mate bond screaming a protest against the separation. But he recognized the undeniable logic and her unwavering resolve. This moment of strategic separation was the final, devastating setup for the climax. Kael grasped her face, his gaze burning, fierce, and desperate. "You survive this, Selene," he commanded, his voice raw with emotion. I will not live in a world where you do not breathe. His words were not a promise, they were a vow, a testament to the depth of the love and trust that had grown in the shadow of war. Selene nodded, her own heart aching with a fierce, answering passion. Then you survive, Alpha Kael, she replied, her own resolve a visible force. Because I need the world where you rule. The moment broke. Selene sprinted toward the goat track, Anya and the scouts following her without question. Kael, watching her until she vanished into the shadows, turned a terrifying mask of controlled violence descending over his features. He drew his massive sword, its silver blade catching the faint moonlight. He led his warriors into the narrow pass mouth, ready to meet the Ironwood forces head-on. The stage was set, the execution of the plan was underway, and the final, brutal confrontation was inevitable. The climax was moments away, fueled by fear, desire, and unyielding courage. Chapter 16: The Ambush and the Fall. The treacherous climb up the goat track was a blur of scraping boots and ragged breaths. Following the intense, desperate separation from Kael, Selene focused solely on the uneven terrain, the silver knife Kael had given her feeling cold and solid in her grasp. The air was thin, biting at their lungs, and the scent of the approaching Ironwood pack, mixed with the musky trail of the traitor Torvin, grew stronger with every upward step. Anya, running beside her, moved with the quiet respect of a warrior who had finally recognized a true leader. They reached the ridge just as the vanguard of the Ironwood forces began pouring into the narrow mouth of the Silver Pass below, right into Kael's line of fire. It was a precise, terrifying synchronization. Selene gave the silent signal, and the Northern Peak scouts rained down a flurry of distraction tactics, smoke arrows and loud, disruptive cries, designed to confuse the enemy and give Kael the opening he needed. The battle below erupted instantly, a cacophony of snarls, shouts, and the sickening sound of impact. The initial exchange was brutal, a terrifying success for Kael's forces. But the traitor, Torvin, was cunning. He hadn't been with the vanguard. Instead, he had utilized his knowledge of the Northern Peak's ancient defense systems. Suddenly, a deafening crack split the air, not from the pass, but from the cliff face directly above Kael's position. Torvin had triggered an ancient, overlooked rock slide. Massive boulders, silent killers in the darkness, tore free from the high slope, hurtling toward Kael and his exposed strike force. Selene watched in sheer, agonizing horror as the massive stones descended. It was a terrible, decisive major setback. She screamed Kael's name, a sound ripped from her soul, but it was lost in the roar of the descending rockfall. A direct hit scattered Kael's warriors like leaves, his shield beta was crushed instantly. Selene searched frantically for Kael amidst the chaos and dust, her vision blurred by mounting terror. She finally saw him, not running, but standing over a wounded warrior, shielding him just as the worst of the slide struck his flank. He was hurled backward with brutal force, disappearing beneath a pile of rubble and pulverized stone. The ensuing silence was worse than the noise. Despair, immediate and profound, crashed over Selene, crushing the fierce resolve she had cultivated in the vault. The shock was paralyzing. Anya grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the exposed ridge. "We have to move," Anya ordered, her voice shaking. "We failed." She couldn't finish the word. Selene shook her head violently, the world suddenly reduced to the image of Kael buried beneath the avalanche of rock. He can't be gone. The devastation was absolute, the emotional crucible reaching its breaking point. The remaining Ironwood forces, realizing the slide had decimated the Northern Peak leadership, let out triumphant, hideous howls and began to push forward. Ally and resource lost, Kael, the strongest pillar of her life, was gone. Selene felt a chilling, terrifying isolation. The bond that had thrummed so fiercely in her shoulder was now a dull, aching void. How could she trust anything, or anyone, when the man who claimed her, the man who finally saw her, was ripped away? All hope seemed lost. Chapter 17: The Cold Truth. Following the devastating, brutal rock slide that swallowed Kael, Selene and Anya beat a frantic, agonizing retreat back toward the northern peak compound. They were pursued by the howling, confident Ironwood scouts who were no longer focused on strategy, but on pure, vengeful annihilation. Selene's mind was a maelstrom of shock and denial. She navigated the darkness purely on instinct, her movements mechanical, her body a vessel for grief and terror. The loss was a physical weight, pressing down on her lungs, making every breath a struggle. They burst into the great hall, the same place where Kael had first claimed her, now a scene of utter confusion and fear. The pack elders had gone into full panic, arguing amongst themselves, their voices shrill and useless. Selene, covered in dust and the scent of battle, was a vision of defeat. The elder, Torvin's co-conspirator, saw her and immediately seized the narrative. The claim failed, he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at her. She led the Alpha to his death. The ritual failed, she is a curse on this pack. The public humiliation was a crushing second blow. The younger, more fearful wolves began to murmur agreement. Selene stood amidst the condemnation, too isolated, too vulnerable to fight the rising tide of blame. She had never been so close to despair, the old fear of rejection and inadequacy returning with a savage, debilitating force. This moment of public scapegoating was the emotional crucible designed to shatter her. She realized the truth, they blamed her because it was easier to blame the outsider than to accept the power of the enemy. Amidst the despair and confusion, Anya, though reeling from the battle, stood suddenly beside Selene, her silver fur bristling with protection. Enough! Anya roared, her voice silencing the chaos. I was there. She saved the Ridge. The failure belongs to the traitor who betrayed the Alpha's route. Torvin's father is the curse, not his mate. Anya's fierce loyalty was a lifeline, a desperately needed ally, but the overall situation remained bleak. The sense of utter loss settled over Selene like a shroud. She left the screaming hall and found her way to Kael's private study, the room still smelling faintly of his unique scent. She sank into his heavy leather chair, running her hands over the cold oak desk, trying to find some tangible remnant of his strength. She had fought so hard to prove her worth, to trust, to love, only for fate to deliver this cruel, final blow. She felt a sickening wave of resignation. Her life was destined to be a series of near misses, a constant cycle of hope crushed by rejection and loss. All external resources were gone, and the only ally she had was a shocked Beta. Love and life were threatened simultaneously, leaving her utterly alone in the dark. This was the all-is-lost moment in its bleakest form. Chapter 18, The Whisper of the Bond. Despite the utter bleakness of the tragedy and the isolation of Kael's study, Selene felt a quiet, almost imperceptible shift within her. She was adrift in grief, but the dull ache in her shoulder, the sight of Kael's mark, refused to become utterly silent. It was a faint, stubborn pulse, a whisper of the mate bond, rather than the loud, insistent demand she was used to. This minute detail, this refusal of the bond to completely sever, was the final, crucial hook of the act. She realized, sitting in the cold silence, that if Kael was truly dead, the mark should have torn away, leaving a screaming void of pain. Instead, there was this faint, defiant thrum. This single, tiny inconsistency rekindled a spark of hope, a desperate internal realization that fought against the pervasive despair. A true mate bond does not break unless the soul is gone. Selene began to reflect, forcing her mind away from the paralyzing grief. She reviewed the facts of the rock slide, the incredible power Kael possessed, his uncanny ability to survive impossible odds. She remembered the ferocity of his last vow, I will not live in a world where you do not breathe. That promise, born of fierce love, was a testament to his strength. She needed to be as strong as the love he had shown her. This internal confrontation was the final preparation for the push, forcing her to rely on the only thing she had left, her sharp wits and the desperate conviction of her heart. The resolution came with a sudden, sharp surge of determination. She stood up, her grief momentarily put aside, realizing that succumbing to despair was exactly what Torvin and Ironwood wanted. They were counting on the northern peak collapsing into leaderless confusion. Her survival was now a political and romantic necessity. She gathered the necessary supplies, a map, Kael's spare silver-tipped knife, and a small, worn leather journal she knew he kept hidden. She ignored the protests and fears of the few wolves who saw her leave the study. Her renewed hope fueled a fierce new determination. She knew she could not fight the entire Ironwood pack. She had to find Kael. If that tiny pulse of the bond was real, he was injured, trapped, or held captive. She had to shift the momentum, not through open war, but through a surgical, clandestine mission. The emotional stakes ignited once more, blazing with love, courage, and desperate clarity. She had formulated a solitary, dangerous plan for the final showdown. She was no longer running from rejection, she was running toward the man who had claimed her. She would find him, or she would die trying. She slipped out into the cold night, leaving the chaos behind, moving toward the pass, toward the unknown. Chapter 19, The Silent Hunter. The scent of dust and frozen rock at the Silver Pass was overwhelming, masking the trail of the missing Alpha. Following the desperate realization that the mate bond still pulsed faintly, Selene moved through the ruined battlefield with the silence and focus of a seasoned tracker, not the overlooked girl she once was. Her resolve was a cold, hard stone in her chest, fueled by the conviction that Kael was trapped, not lost. She was guided by the thread of the bond, that low, rhythmic ache in her shoulder that refused to be severed, confirming her profound intuition. She found the site of the rock slide, a chaotic, massive pile of broken stone that seemed impossible to penetrate. Her hope faltered for a second, but she quickly forced her mind back to logic. The traitor, Torvin, would not have simply left Kael to the rocks, he would have secured the body as proof of victory, or worse, captured him for leverage. She realized her focus must be on betrayal, not accident. She circled the wreckage, looking for signs of human interference, ignoring the sickening scent of old blood and pulverized earth. Contrasting the quiet intensity of her search, the first sign of a breakthrough was subtle, a scrape mark on a large, flat slab of rock that showed it had been intentionally moved, not merely dropped by the slide. Nearby, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a faint drag mark leading away from the destruction and toward the deeper, treacherous canyons of the northern hills. Selene followed the trail, her heart hammering a fierce rhythm against her ribs. The prints were deep and irregular, suggesting a massive weight being pulled, confirming her suspicion of capture. She was moving on pure, driven instinct. The unexpected discovery solidified her new identity. She was no longer running from rejection, she was running with fierce love and clarity. She realized the enemy's victory was temporary, they hadn't counted on the resilience of the claimed. She paused, pulling out the map she had brought. The trail led directly toward a hidden ironwood staging post, a remote hunting cabin Torvin must have known about. This realization rekindled her hope with a sharp, bright clarity, transforming her grief into a focused, driven momentum. As she pressed on, the bond's pulse grew infinitesimally stronger, drawing her like a lodestone. She knew she couldn't approach the staging post alone, but she was too far to call for help, and time was their most critical enemy. She needed an ally, and the only one she trusted was the beta who had defended her in the hall. She found a high vantage point and used an old, rarely practiced skill, a silent, high-pitched wolf call, a sound that carried across the immense distance, communicating not panic, but a precise, urgent message only a northern peak beta would recognize. Her calculated risk paid off dramatically. Hours later, Anya materialized from the dense woods, her expression grim but resolute. "I followed your trail," Anya stated, her voice low and efficient. "The pack is mobilizing, but they are still divided. We cannot wait for them." Selene nodded, grateful for the allies' support. They confronted their shared fears, solidifying their strategy. "Kael is at the hunting post," Selene told her, pointing to the map. "He is injured. We go in now, and we go in silence." Their shared preparation, tactical and emotional, was the final, decisive push toward the confrontation. The anticipation was thick, the resolve absolute. Chapter 20, The Hidden Chamber. Following the tense, focused strategy session with Anya, the two wolves moved silently under the cover of a thick, rolling fog that blanketed the canyons, muffling sound and distorting vision. They were driven, intimate in their shared purpose, knowing that this infiltration was their only chance to retrieve Kael before Ironwood's main force arrived. The mate bond thrummed in Selene's shoulder with increased urgency now, a steady, demanding pull that suggested Kael was very near, but also in significant danger. The Ironwood staging post was a rough-hewn hunting cabin, surrounded by a perimeter of newly posted guards. Selene and Anya crept through the dense pine trees, their movements fluid and practiced. Anya, the seasoned warrior, took the lead on neutralizing the external sentries, her actions swift and deadly. Selene, the strategist, focused on the layout of the cabin, noticing the subtle architectural inconsistency, a single, small window that didn't align with the other structures. The realization that the structure contained a hidden space was instantaneous. The cellar, Selene whispered to Anya, pointing to the odd window. It's a secret chamber, not a simple basement. They are keeping him below. Anya nodded, her eyes flashing with grim understanding. They had their target. Their emotional and tactical preparation was complete, and now the execution began. To prevent the antagonists from noticing their plan, Selene initiated a small, controlled distraction. She used her knowledge of medicinal herbs to create a small, localized smoke screen on the far side of the cabin, drawing two of the remaining guards away from the entrance. Kael's enemies, oblivious to the deeper threat, noticed the smoke and immediately mobilized toward the distraction. The shift in their situation created a desperate opening. Anya, utilizing the brief confusion, efficiently dispatched the final guard at the main entrance. They slipped inside. The cabin's interior was dark and smelled of stale firewood and cheap liquor. They found the entrance to the hidden chamber, a heavy rug concealing a trapdoor, just as Selene had predicted. She lifted the door, revealing a steep, damp set of wooden stairs leading down into the earth. The smell from the cellar was immediate and chilling, Kael's scent, thick and musky with dried blood and extreme duress. Selene hesitated only for a heartbeat, her resolve absolute. She descended into the black hole, Anya close behind. The anticipation, resolve, and fear mixed with the fierce desire to protect her mate, reaching an unbearable peak. She could feel the closeness of Ironwood scouts approaching the main cabin, alerted by the scent of the struggle outside. They were racing against the clock. The stage was perfectly set for the peak climax, the emotional and romantic stakes maximized. Chapter 21, The Rescuer's Promise. The air in the hidden chamber was cold and dense, heavy with the metallic tang of dried injury. Following the intense infiltration of the Ironwood post, Selene found Kael chained to the damp stone wall. He was unconscious, his massive body slumped, his head bleeding from a terrible blow, but he was alive. The mate bond, though faint, pulsed insistently, a desperate, rhythmic plea for relief. He was surrounded by the evidence of Torvin's cruelty, broken restraints, scorch marks from attempts to burn his silver mark, and the overwhelming scent of pain. Selene rushed to him, ignoring the danger still raging above them. She knelt, checking his shallow breath, her hands shaking with fear and profound relief. She spoke to him, her voice low and fierce with love, trying to draw him back from the edge. "Kael, wake up," she whispered, smoothing the thick, matted hair from his face. "You made a vow. You have to breathe." Her touch, the connection of their hands, was the initial step toward healing. The quiet moment of desperate intimacy was brutally interrupted. The trapdoor above them creaked open. Torvin, the cunning traitor, stood framed in the dim light, a vicious sneer twisting his face. "The little mouse comes for her Alpha," Torvin hissed, descending the steps slowly, a heavy, ceremonial silver chain draped over his shoulder. "You failed your purity test, girl. Now you die for him. Torvin intended to execute Kael and Selene in front of Ironwood as proof of his success. The final confrontation was upon them. Anya surged forward with a fierce growl, meeting Torvin's attack. The fight was a blur of primal fury and desperation, loud and brutal in the confined space. Selene, knowing she could not defeat Torvin, turned her attention to Kael. She found the release for his chains, a complex iron lock, hidden in the shadows. She worked frantically, her fingers bleeding against the sharp metal, praying the distraction provided by Anya would last. The immediate aftermath of the fight was critical. Anya, though a superb warrior, was outmatched by Torvin's silver weaponry and maniacal rage. She was thrown against the wall, stunned. Selene, with a final, desperate twist, broke the last mechanism. Kael's heavy chains clattered to the stone floor. Torvin roared in triumph, turning toward Selene, his eyes fixed on the final execution. Just as Torvin lunged, Selene grabbed Kael's combat knife and, with a last, desperate surge of courage, plunged the silver tip into the ground next to Kael's unmoving hand, creating a sharp distraction and a small obstacle. The emotional stakes for all three were at a maximum. The stage was set for the absolute climax. Chapter 22, The Claiming Fire. Torvin roared in frustration as the silver knife Selene planted beside Kael's hand deflected his lunge, forcing him to momentarily stumble. The desperate action of planting the knife bought Selene the fraction of a second she needed for the true climax. She flung herself over Kael's unconscious body, protecting him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The scent of betrayal and desperation was thick in the chamber, but beneath it, the mate bond in Kael stirred, responding to her physical protection. Torvin recovered instantly, his eyes fixed on Selene with manic hatred. "You will die first, little witch," he shrieked, raising his heavy silver chain for a crushing blow. Just as the chain descended, the bond between Selene and Kael exploded, not in pain, but in a blinding, incandescent rush of shared power. Kael's eyes snapped open, blazing molten gold, not with conscious thought, but with the primal fury of an alpha whose mate was in lethal danger. The sudden surge of power was terrifying and transformative. Kael, still half-conscious, moved with a speed that defied his injuries. He grabbed the silver knife Selene had planted and surged upwards, a terrifying, savage blur of raw instinct. He met Torvin's attack not with finesse, but with the untamed, earth-shattering power of a pure alpha claiming his own. The fight was short, fierce, and absolute. Kael, driven by the furious heat of the bond, ended the traitor's threat with a decisive, brutal movement, silencing Torvin forever. The conflict was resolved in a flash of elemental power. Kael collapsed immediately afterward, the primal surge draining his last reserves, but his hand remained fiercely gripping Selene's wrist. The intense heat radiating from his palm was overwhelming, flooding her body with a wave of healing energy and undeniable possession. This was the mate bond fully realized, a public and private claiming under the most lethal circumstances. The transformation was complete. Selene, no longer the insecure, rejected shadow, was the confident, courageous mate who had stared down death and drawn her alpha back from the void. The immediate aftermath was chaotic but conclusive. Anya, recovering quickly, secured the chamber. The Ironwood forces above, having heard the terrifying alpha roar and the subsequent silence, panicked. Their commander, realizing Torvin had failed, initiated a confused, frantic retreat. Selene and Anya helped the severely injured Kael up the steps and into the stolen Ironwood transport. As they sped away from the ruined cabin, Kael, though barely conscious, leaned his head against Selene's, murmuring against her hair. "Luna," he breathed, the word a rasp of pain and profound reverence. "My Luna." The pack reacted not with scorn, but with the awe reserved for true, battle-forged power. Chapter 23, The Unbroken Vow. Following the terrifying, triumphant escape from the Ironwood post, the journey back to Northern Peak was a period of intense, focused healing and deep emotional connection. Kael was severely injured but stable, resting in the shielded transport with Selene constantly at his side. The aftermath of the fight required immediate reconciliation and resolution of plot threads. Anya, driving the transport, had already sent a coded message announcing the defeat of the traitor and the capture of their Ironwood spy, restoring order to the beleaguered Northern Peak forces. Selene remained glued to Kael, constantly pouring her own strength into the mate bond, aiding his supernatural recovery. His grip on her was possessive, almost desperate, a confirmation of the depth of his fear of loss. The silence between them was heavy with exhaustion and deep, fulfilled love. When Kael finally woke fully, he looked at her not with the cold calculation of the alpha of the frozen heart, but with the raw, unwavering gaze of a wolf who had been given a second chance. He reached up, his movements slow, and gently touched the mark on her shoulder, the site of their accidental claiming. "I almost lost you," he whispered, his voice still rough, devoid of its usual authority. "I spent days buried beneath those rocks, knowing the bond was still there, but fighting the darkness. You were the light, Selene. You are the reason I fought to breathe again." This open confession of his vulnerability, his reliance on her, was a crucial moment of character growth. It tied up the major emotional thread of his arc, his transformation from emotionally shut down to capable of profound trust. The realization settled over her that her years of rejection had not been pointless. They had tempered her, giving her the strength and clear sight necessary to save him. She kissed him then, not a fierce claim, but a soft, tender affirmation of their shared future. "I came for you, Alpha Kael," she murmured against his mouth. "I will always come for you." Thematic resonance was achieved. The rejected girl was now the confident, courageous heart of the strongest pack. The new normal was established moments before their arrival. Kael, regaining his strength, looked at her, his eyes blazing with renewed command. "You stood in the face of my enemies and claimed your right," he stated, his authority solidifying, but now imbued with tenderness. "You are my equal. You are the Luna of the Northern Peak, not by fate, but by fire." The new normal was established, their relationship solidified publicly and privately, ready for the world to see the transformation. Chapter 24, The Iron and the Flame. The Northern Peak compound erupted in a cacophony of relief, celebration, and awe as the transport carrying Kael and Selene arrived. Following the intimate reconciliation of their bond, they emerged, Kael leaning heavily on Selene, his massive frame supported by her unwavering presence. This public display, the formidable alpha reliant on the strength of his mate, was the visual finality of their transformation. The remaining elders who had challenged them immediately bowed, their initial scorn replaced by profound respect for the Luna who had survived their deadly test and saved their leader. Anya, standing proudly beside them, was the first to openly bow. Selene looked out over the faces of the pack, the warriors, the families, the young pups, and felt a wave of protective fierce love. She was no longer insecure, she was the confident, revered Luna. The final resolution was swift and definitive. Kael, standing beside Selene, addressed the pack with resonant authority. He named Anya as his new beta, citing her unwavering loyalty and courage during the crisis. He then addressed the internal traitors, ensuring justice was meted out, solidifying the pack's security under the new regime. He did this not with brute force, but with the measured, calm confidence that came from having his mate at his side, correcting his blind spots. The scene concluded with a private, intimate moment in the quiet of Kael's study. He was sitting at his desk, stronger now, but still recovering. Selene stood behind him, placing her hands on his broad, fur-covered shoulders. She felt the powerful thrum of his healing heart, a steady, comforting rhythm. "We won," she whispered, the relief making her voice tremble. "We survived." Kael turned his head, kissing her palm. "We did more than survive, Selene," he murmured, his gaze intense. "We claimed a strength we didn't know we possessed." The new emotional equilibrium was palpable, their love fulfilled and secure. They stood, looking out over the mountains, a formidable, united front. Kael, the cold alpha, was vulnerable yet stronger for it. Selene, the rejected girl, was a warrior who had found her worth and claimed her destiny. Their bond was the union of iron and flame, unbreakable and absolute. 1 year later. The air in Northern Peak is cleaner, the fortress more welcoming, yet still fiercely secure. Selene, now the official Luna, stands beside Kael during a pack gathering. She is visibly pregnant, her hand resting over her swell. They rule not just with force, but with wisdom and justice, having integrated her intelligence with his power. The children flock to her without fear. Kael looks at her, his gaze filled with proprietary love, and she smiles, a radiant, confident curve of her lips. They are respected, they are feared, and they are secure in the bond that was forged in betrayal and claimed by fire, hinting at a future where their legacy, and new challenges, will continue.